Good evening, dear listener. Please set your volume to a gentle level, just enough to hear my voice. Close your eyes, rest your body, and let the silence wrap around you. Together, we will drift slowly into sleep. Tonight begins our first story in the series Boring History for Sleep, a quiet journey through the endless edicts of Chinese dynasties. If you enjoy this calm storytelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more sleepy history to you, night after night. Now, let us begin. The story of China, stretching across millennia, is not only marked by emperors and battles, but also by the quiet, almost endless rhythm of edicts. These were the official documents issued from the throne, proclamations that carried the weight of law, ritual, and tradition. They filled the archives of dynasties, page after page, scroll after scroll, until the very act of reading them could lull even the most diligent scholar into drowsiness. Tonight, we drift gently into that world, a world where every decree was carefully written in formal language, repeated in patterns that barely changed from one ruler to the next. If you allow your mind to follow the rhythm, it is like the sound of water dripping, steady, predictable, without hurry. Imagine the imperial court, silent except for the scratching of brushes on silk or bamboo slips. A decree begins. By the mandate of heaven, it is hereby ordered, and what follows could be anything from the fixing of tax quotas to the arrangement of rituals for the coming harvest festival. The wording hardly ever changed, each sentence framed with careful balance, each phrase weighed against precedent. Officials bowed, recorded the words, and then sent them out across the provinces. Messengers rode for days and weeks, carrying these edicts to remote corners of the empire, where local magistrates would read them aloud in monotone voices to villagers who barely understood the ritual phrases. The people listened, nodded, and then went back to their fields, for the decrees often had little to do with their daily struggles. Yet the cycle never stopped. Every new emperor, upon ascending the throne, issued edicts of gratitude, edicts of mourning for his predecessor, edicts of reform, and edicts of reassurance to the people. Each one was nearly identical to the last dynasty's words, altered only slightly, as if time itself moved in circles. Scholars copied them into great collections. Whole libraries became filled with bound volumes of nothing but decrees, rules about how many oxen could be sacrificed, instructions for the timing of lunar ceremonies, commands to repair canals, lists of acceptable gifts to the throne, prohibitions on clothing that appeared too extravagant, and countless reiterations of tax policy. Reading through these edicts was like walking through an endless corridor where each door opened onto the same view. One emperor might say, "Let the people be at peace, let taxes be fair." And another 2 centuries later would say, "Let the people be at peace, let taxes be fair." The repetition became almost soothing. Officials in charge of drafting the edicts knew this, yet they kept the style unchanged, for tradition was stronger than innovation. To break the formula was to risk offending heaven, or worse, confusing the bureaucracy. So the words repeated again and again. Consider the Han Dynasty, with its immense bureaucracy. Every spring, edicts announced the rituals of plowing, even though everyone already knew them. Every autumn, edicts prescribed offerings at the ancestral temple, though the steps had not changed in generations. Later dynasties followed the same model. In the Tang Dynasty, an edict might concern the color of officials' robes, ensuring that the hierarchy remained visible. In the Song Dynasty, another edict might restate rules for examination candidates, identical to rules from a century before. The Qing emperors, writing in Manchu and Chinese, issued edicts regulating everything from the price of salt to the number of tassels permitted on official hats. One could say these documents were the heartbeat of the empire, slow, steady, unchanging, keeping rhythm while centuries passed. For the scholar tasked with compiling them, the work was both honorable and endless. Sitting by the dim light of an oil lamp, he would copy one decree after another, his brush moving steadily, his mind drifting into the same monotonous phrases. If he were tired, the words might blur, but the pattern of the sentences carried him along like the rocking of a boat. To read these edicts today is to feel the same weight of time pressing gently on the eyelids. They do not excite the imagination. They do not thrill with sudden discoveries. Instead, they create a calm repetition, a reminder that most of history is not made of battles or revolutions, but of paperwork, routine, and the slow turning of seasons. Think of the endless rain falling on palace tiles, day after day, year after year, while inside the court scribes write another edict in almost the same words as yesterday. This is the story we begin tonight. It is not dramatic. It is not filled with heroes or villains. It is simply the steady flow of imperial commands, preserved across centuries, until the archives themselves became so vast that even emperors could not read all that their ancestors had decreed. And so we let the monotony of these words guide us into stillness, as countless scholars once did, drifting slowly, gently towards sleep. If we narrow our gaze to the Han Dynasty, we find a perfect example of how edicts became the silent backbone of rule. The Han emperors, inheriting the bureaucratic systems of the Qin, relied heavily on formal proclamations to bind together a vast territory that stretched from the edges of the deserts to the fertile plains of the Yangtze. Every matter, great or small, found its way into an edict. A command to standardize weights and measures, a reminder that officials should not accept bribes, a declaration that the emperor would personally perform the spring plowing ritual, all came forth in the same solemn form. Year after year, these decrees were read aloud in dusty provincial offices, where local administrators bowed and nodded before filing them into archives already swollen with similar words. Imagine a farmer called into the village square to hear such an edict proclaimed. The magistrate would stand, scroll in hand, and begin with the traditional preface. By the mandate of heaven, His Majesty decrees, followed by sentences that spoke of balance, harmony, loyalty, and diligence. The farmer might not fully grasp the phrases, yet the tone was unmistakable. It was serious, authoritative, and ultimately routine. When he returned to his field, little in his life had changed. Still, the rhythm of such announcements created a sense of continuity, a reminder that the emperor, though distant, was always present in form through the written word. Scholars, too, felt the weight of these proclamations. In imperial academies, students copied passages from edicts as writing practice, learning not only the characters, but the cadence of official language. A single edict on the regulation of canal repairs could be studied for its calligraphy style, its balance of words, its invocation of cosmic order. Over time, the repetition lulled even ambitious students into a quiet acceptance that the empire's true strength lay not in sudden innovation, but in the steady preservation of forms. Centuries later, the Tang dynasty followed the same pattern, issuing countless decrees that varied only in detail. One emperor might proclaim that certain musical instruments were to be played in ceremonies. Another might announce that the planting of mulberry trees for silk was encouraged, yet the words were framed in the same mold. To modern readers, paging through these records, the monotony is striking. The differences between one reign and another blur, like faint brushstrokes repeated across a long scroll. Even in the Song dynasty, known for its refinement and scholarship, the endless issuing of edicts continued without pause. An emperor might command stricter examination rules, ensuring that candidates did not cheat, or he might forbid officials from wearing luxurious garments beyond their station. Each decree looked almost indistinguishable from one issued centuries before, the same invocation of heaven's mandate, the same assurance that order and virtue would be maintained. The bureaucracy demanded it, and tradition confirmed it. To listen closely is to hear not one emperor's voice, but a chorus of voices repeating the same steady notes, generation after generation. Imagine sitting in the silent hall of a provincial yamen, oil lamps flickering, as a clerk reads aloud yet another imperial order about grain storage or tax remission. The villagers listen politely, the officials bow, and then the scroll is rolled up and stored. Another sheet in a growing pile. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just the slow accumulation of words, as regular as the turning of the seasons. The effect is strangely calming. When seen from afar, the history of these edicts resembles the steady pulse of a heart, beating without rest, carrying life through the empire. The Han set the rhythm, the Tang repeated it, the Song refined it, and later dynasties continued the same tune. For the historian, the monotony may feel heavy, but for the weary listener drifting into sleep, it is a gentle sound, the quiet hum of bureaucracy stretching across the centuries, whispering of order, stability, and the unchanging flow of time. As centuries turned and dynasties rose and fell, the Ming dynasty emerged, restoring Han Chinese rule after the fall of the UN. With it came not only grand palaces, voyages across the seas, and bustling cities, but also the steady rhythm of edicts that continued as though time itself had not moved. The Ming emperors, like their predecessors, leaned on these proclamations as instruments of authority, wrapping every command in ritual formality. Imagine the vast halls of the Forbidden City, red walls stretching into the mist, while within the palace scribes dipped brushes into ink and copied line after line of imperial orders. One edict might instruct local magistrates to supervise the construction of dikes to control the flooding of the Yellow River. Another might dictate the exact procedures for offerings at ancestral temples. Another might admonish officials for corruption, yet all were expressed in the same deliberate and measured style. To read one is to read them all, and to listen to them is to feel the soft echo of centuries repeating. The bureaucracy of the Ming thrived on this repetition. Civil officials, trained through the rigid examination system, absorbed the cadences of earlier edicts until they became second nature. A decree regulating the weight of coins might echo the language of a decree on the repair of city walls, both framed with appeals to heaven's harmony and the emperor's benevolence. For the common people, the arrival of such edicts was a familiar sight. A runner from the provincial capital would arrive, dusty from travel, unroll the parchment, and read aloud the words of the throne. Villagers would stand, heads bowed, not in anticipation of novelty, but in resignation to continuity. The words affirmed that the empire was still in motion, that the same voice still flowed from the capital, reaching even the most remote hamlets. When the Qing dynasty succeeded the Ming, bringing Manchu rule to China, the language of edicts continued without disruption, now rendered both in Chinese and in Manchu script. The rulers from the north understood the necessity of appearing legitimate, and so they cloaked themselves in the very traditions they had inherited. Edicts under the Qing regulated hairstyles, mandating that Han men adopt the Manchu queue, yet the documents were framed in the same solemn rhetoric used for centuries. Other edicts concerned taxation, trade along the borders, the conduct of officials, or the punishment of rebels. But beneath the surface, they resembled the endless decrees of the Han, Tang, and Ming. To the ear of a clerk, they were nearly indistinguishable, the same rolling cadence, the same assurances of stability and peace. Within the Forbidden City, scribes copied them onto scrolls that filled entire rooms, while outside, local magistrates received, stored, and proclaimed them in endless repetition. Scholars compiling histories of the Qing soon discovered that each reign produced thousands upon thousands of such proclamations, so many that reading them in succession produced not insight, but fatigue. Yet fatigue was part of their power. They lulled officials and subjects alike into the acceptance of continuity, into the quiet belief that the empire was unshaken because the words remained unchanged. When the emperor issued an edict of mourning for a departed consort, it followed the exact formula used by ancestors long gone. When an edict proclaimed rewards for military victories, it employed the same ceremonial language used for centuries of battles. When an edict granted tax relief after floods or drought, it echoed countless previous proclamations of compassion. The repetition itself was the message, whispering that no matter the ruler's face, the empire endured. Imagine a scholar in the Qing era, seated at a wooden desk under dim lamplight, copying one decree after another into bound volumes. His brush moved in steady strokes, his eyelids heavy, the phrases so familiar that his mind drifted between wakefulness and sleep. The endless edicts were not thrilling, they were not dramatic, they were not meant to stir the heart, but rather to preserve the illusion of unbroken order. For those who lived within their reach, the words became background noise to daily life, like the regular tolling of a bell, steady, predictable, guiding the empire onward without pause. In this way, from the Ming through the Qing, the cycle of edicts stretched without end, mirroring the slow, inevitable passage of time, comforting in their monotony, soporific in their unchanging form, and perfectly suited to lull the modern listener into the soft embrace of sleep. To understand the true weight of imperial decrees, one must picture the archives themselves. Vast and silent halls where shelves groaned under the accumulation of centuries. Within these repositories lay tens of thousands of scrolls, each containing words that to the modern reader might appear nearly identical, yet to the clerks and archivists of the time carried the heavy authority of law and tradition. Imagine walking slowly into such a chamber, the air heavy with the faint smell of ink and paper, the light dim as though the sun itself dared not intrude on such monotony. Scroll after scroll bore titles like Edict on the Repair of Irrigation Ditches, Edict on Mourning Protocols, Edict on Salt Distribution, or Edict on the Proper Timing of Spring Sacrifices. Each document was carefully copied by hand, stored in bundles, catalogued, and then rarely, if ever, read again. The act of preservation was itself the ritual, the sense that every word of the emperor, no matter how small, had to be preserved for eternity. Generations of archivists worked quietly in these halls, bending over desks, copying characters until their wrists ached, their minds numbed by the endless repetition. To one such archivist, a decree from the Tang dynasty regulating horse fodder might be indistinguishable from a decree from the Song dynasty about rice planting, for the structure and phrasing followed the same pattern, invoking heaven, praising virtue, demanding loyalty, and prescribing order. Yet all were kept, bound carefully into volumes so large that scholars joked no single human could ever hope to read them all in a lifetime. The archives of the Qing, for example, became so immense that entire bureaus were dedicated solely to organizing them. A bureaucracy designed to manage bureaucracy. Within the Forbidden City, countless clerks worked in silence, their brushes scratching steadily as another decree was copied and stored. The silence was broken only by the occasional roll of parchment, the shuffling of papers, or the quiet sigh of a weary scribe. If one paused to read the text, it seemed as though time itself stood still. The emperor declared that officials should act with integrity, that taxes should be fair, that rituals should be performed on schedule, that canals should be repaired, that rebels should be punished, that rewards should be granted to the loyal, and that heaven's favor should be preserved through order and obedience. The themes never varied, and so reading became an act not of discovery but of endurance. Imagine a scholar, centuries later, attempting to research a particular practice, only to wade through volumes of edicts that repeated the same phrases. His eyes grew heavy, his hand traced the familiar formulae, and he found himself lulled into a state between thought and sleep. It was not unlike listening to the steady beating of a drum, or the repetitive dripping of water, soothing in its constancy. Even emperors themselves were overwhelmed by their own archives. Some admitted openly that they could not possibly review every document produced under their reign, and so they relied on clerks to summarize, though the summaries themselves often echoed the same tired formulas. The true message of the archives was not content but continuity, not innovation but permanence. For subjects of the empire, the knowledge that these archives existed offered reassurance that the empire was unshaken, that every word was preserved, that nothing was lost to time, even if no one would ever read it again. It is easy to imagine, in those dimly lit halls, a visitor standing quietly, running fingers along rows of scrolls, feeling the immense weight of history pressing down. Yet instead of stirring awe, the feeling is one of heaviness, of drowsiness, for the sheer sameness of the words dulls the senses. The archives were not meant to inspire, they were meant to endure. And in that endurance, they offer to us today the same gentle monotony that once lulled archivists, scholars, and officials into quiet submission, into sleep, into the slow surrender of thought to the unchanging flow of ritual words. If the archives were where decrees went to rest, the village square was where they came briefly to life, though even in that setting their effect was one of quiet monotony rather than excitement. Picture a small town in the provinces, houses with tiled roofs, streets of packed earth, and at the center a wooden platform where the local magistrate would gather the people. The occasion was the arrival of an imperial edict, carried across long distances by a courier who had traveled days, perhaps weeks, through fields and mountains, simply to deliver words that most of those gathered would already expect to hear. The ritual followed a pattern that had been repeated countless times across countless dynasties. The magistrate, dressed in official robes, would stand with scroll in hand. Assistants might strike a gong to call villagers from their work. Farmers wiped dust from their clothes. Merchants left their stalls, children clustered around their parents, all waiting with quiet resignation. When the magistrate unrolled the parchment, he did not read with passion, for passion had no place in such formality. Instead, his voice was steady, slow, and deliberate, each phrase pronounced with the same cadence as the one before. By the mandate of heaven, His Majesty decrees. began nearly every proclamation, no matter the subject. The crowd listened politely as the words continued. Instructions for planting in accordance with the calendar, reminders of taxes due at harvest, admonitions against harboring bandits, or praises for loyalty shown by soldiers at the frontier. The words were clear and sound, but often distant in meaning, filled with phrases that emphasized harmony, virtue, and cosmic balance rather than specific details of daily life. Once the reading was complete, there was usually no discussion. The people bowed or saluted, the magistrate rolled the scroll closed, and the crowd dispersed. Life returned to its rhythm, unchanged. The farmer went back to his field, the merchant to his stall, the children to their games, while the scroll itself was placed carefully into storage. What mattered was not novelty but continuity, the reassurance that the emperor's voice had once again reached even the most remote corner of the empire. Over centuries, this ritual of reading became as familiar as the cycle of seasons. It was less an act of communication than one of confirmation. The empire was still intact, the throne still spoke, heaven's order still flowed downward through officials, clerks, and magistrates to the ears of common people. To stand in such a square, hearing the same words repeated year after year, was to be gently reminded that nothing had changed and that nothing was expected to change. The monotony itself became comforting, like the toll of a bell in a temple or the measured strike of a drum at a ritual. Officials who read these decrees often did so with little energy, not because they lacked respect, but because the formula demanded steadiness. Their voices droned evenly, the phrases long and predictable, the entire performance designed not to excite, but to affirm. To the villager listening, it was like hearing the same story told again and again, a story whose ending was always known. For the modern mind, this may seem dull, but in that very dullness lies the secret of its endurance. The empire survived through repetition, through rituals that required no thought, but only participation. In the silence that followed each reading, the people felt the weight of the empire, not through fear or joy, but through the simple realization that the words of the emperor, though far away, continued to fall upon their ears. In time, the very sound of an edict being read became as much a part of life as the crowing of roosters at dawn or the turning of seasons, a background hum of authority, steady and soothing. For those listening now, across centuries, the effect remains the same. The cadence of official words, spoken in endless formula, carries no urgency, no drama, only the slow assurance that time flows, that order continues, and that the world remains as it was. To close one's eyes while imagining such a scene is to hear the monotone of history itself, a voice stretched thin across dynasties, a lullaby written not in poetry, but in bureaucracy, quiet, steady, and eternal. When one compares decrees across dynasties, the striking truth is how similar they are, as though time itself had frozen and every emperor merely copied the words of his predecessor with only the slightest adjustment. A decree issued in the Han Dynasty about the fairness of taxation could be set beside a decree from the Tang, or the Ming, or even the Qing, and the differences would be so minor that only a scholar searching for detail could notice them. The phrasing remained constant, the invocations unchanged, the promises repeated endlessly. Let the people be nourished, let the officials be upright, let the realm be in harmony under heaven. These phrases appeared again and again, a mantra of governance stretching over centuries. It was not that emperors lacked creativity, but that creativity was dangerous when it came to the language of authority. Stability was best conveyed by repetition, and so the edicts became a mirror of each other, generation after generation. If one emperor ordered the repair of dikes along the Yellow River, another centuries later would do the same in almost identical terms, as though the river itself demanded the same words to tame its floods. If one emperor cautioned against the extravagance of officials' clothing, another in a later era would echo that very concern, warning in the same solemn cadence that frugality was the path to virtue. Even edicts of mourning for deceased rulers followed an almost unbroken formula, speaking of filial piety, cosmic order, and the duty of the living to uphold the traditions of the past. Reading them in sequence is like listening to a chant, steady and hypnotic, each voice blending into the next until one can no longer tell where one dynasty ends and another begins. The scribes who copied them must have felt this deeply, for their task was rarely to innovate but to replicate. ensuring that the words of one emperor aligned perfectly with the words of those who came before. They wrote in careful calligraphy, preserving not just meaning but form, producing documents that looked nearly identical across centuries. To open a volume of Ming edicts beside a volume of Qing edicts is to see the same layout, the same brushstrokes, the same ceremonial language, only the names and dates altered. To the scholar seeking novelty, this was exhausting, but to the empire, it was reassurance. Continuity was proof of legitimacy, and so the sameness of the words was the very essence of power. The people too learned to expect this repetition. When a decree was read aloud in a village square, no one leaned forward in anticipation of surprise. They already knew the words before they were spoken, for they had heard them in similar form many times before. The decree might as well have been a ritual chant, familiar and predictable, and yet this predictability created comfort. In a world where floods, droughts, or invasion could disrupt lives, the voice of the emperor remained unchanged, steady as the turning of the seasons. The decrees told the people that the empire endured, that order still prevailed, that life would continue as it had always continued. In this way, the repetition was not merely bureaucratic laziness, but a deliberate tool of governance, a lullaby of authority sung over a vast population. For the modern listener, drifting into sleep, these repeated phrases work the same way. They carry no drama, no urgency, only the slow weight of continuity, a reminder that history is not all battles and heroes, but also the unbroken flow of words written, copied, read, and then forgotten. Words that look the same, no matter which century they belong to. The sameness becomes a kind of eternity, each edict reflecting another, until they blur together into a single voice, the quiet voice of empire, murmuring endlessly through time. Among the countless edicts that filled the shelves of dynastic archives, some of the most persistent were those that concerned the smallest details of ritual and daily order, for emperors and officials believed that the harmony of the cosmos depended not on grand gestures alone, but on the precise repetition of minor practices. Thus we find edicts that dictated the colors of robes for court officials, the length of tassels on ceremonial hats, the number of bows required at an ancestral rite, and the sequence in which incense sticks should be lit. To the modern mind, these details seem trivial, but to the imperial state, they were the threads that held the great tapestry of rule together. Every dynasty produced such decrees, and every dynasty repeated the same instructions with only the faintest variations, so that a rule issued in the Tang concerning the proper use of jade pendants might echo centuries later in the Qing, framed in nearly identical words. The bureaucracy thrived on this repetition, for it offered clerks endless material to copy and reaffirmed the idea that order could be maintained through precise conformity. Agriculture, too, was bound tightly to edicts. Each spring, the emperor would issue a decree reminding subjects of the rituals of plowing, often announcing that he himself would symbolically guide a plow through the earth to demonstrate diligence. These edicts described the act in solemn language, praising the connection between ruler and soil, heaven and earth. But the ritual itself never changed, and the edicts themselves repeated the same phrases generation after generation. The farmers who heard such proclamations already knew when to plant, for their knowledge came from the land and the seasons, not from the court. Yet the edict was read aloud nonetheless, a reminder that the throne claimed responsibility for harmony in the fields. Other edicts regulated sacrifices to heaven, earth, the sun, the moon, and the ancestors, specifying which animals were to be offered, how many vessels of wine should be poured, what music should accompany the ceremony, and even the timing of each action according to the lunar calendar. These documents read like recipes repeated endlessly, their tone solemn but their content unchanging, and the officials who carried them out treated them as obligations rather than revelations. Even clothing for commoners came under the scope of decrees. There were edicts forbidding peasants from wearing silk beyond a certain grade, edicts restricting the use of bright colors to certain classes, edicts reminding people to keep distinctions clear between those of high status and those of low. These rules, copied over and over, rarely altered life in the villages where necessity dictated clothing more than imperial order, but the words filled the archives just the same, another layer of repetition to be preserved and transmitted. The same was true for edicts about examinations. Each dynasty issued decrees about the fairness of the testing halls, the prohibition of smuggling notes, the penalties for cheating, and the requirements for candidates. But these rules had been stated so many times before that they became a kind of bureaucratic chorus. To read them one after another is to hear the same notes played repeatedly, the same melody of caution and regulation, a song without end. All of these small instructions, from tassels to sacrifices, from plowing rituals to examination rules, formed the daily hum of empire. They were not meant to stir the imagination, but to settle it, to assure everyone that the world still followed the same pattern, that heaven's order was intact, that no detail was too small to escape regulation. And in their very monotony lay their power, for monotony itself conveyed stability. To close your eyes and picture the reading of such an edict is to hear the slow cadence of a voice reciting familiar words, words that had been spoken many times before and would be spoken many times again. Words that blur into one another until they become less a command than a lullaby of empire, steady, repetitive, and eternal. Beyond rituals and clothing, imperial decrees reached deep into the economic life of the empire. And yet, even in matters of trade, taxation, and resources, the words repeated themselves endlessly, generation after generation, until they formed an unchanging pattern that lulled both officials and subjects into the comfort of predictability. Among the most common were edicts on taxation, for every dynasty needed grain, silk, and coins to support the court, the armies, and the bureaucracy. Year after year, rulers proclaimed in solemn tones the expectation that taxes be collected fairly, that officials not exploit the people, that registers be kept in good order. The formulas barely changed. Let the burden not be too heavy, let the people be nourished, let the realm prosper through balance. Yet behind these familiar phrases lay the same demands, the same quotas, the same inevitable pressure on farmers to surrender part of their harvest. To a villager listening to such a decree, it was not news, but confirmation of what was already known. Salt, too, became a constant subject of decrees, for the state often monopolized its trade, ensuring that one of life's necessities flowed only under imperial control. Edicts announced prices, restated punishments for smuggling, reaffirmed distribution routes, and praised officials who managed the system with diligence. The same instructions appeared across the Tang, the Song, the Ming, and the Qing, until the words themselves seemed to harden into salt, preserved for centuries. Reading them one after another is like watching identical waves lap against the same shore, steady, predictable, and unchanging. Grain storage was another favorite subject. Emperors issued countless decrees about maintaining granaries, repairing storage buildings, measuring grain carefully, and releasing reserves in times of famine. Each edict promised compassion, urged officials to act quickly, and cited heaven's will that the people be fed. Yet the same decrees had been issued before, and the same decrees would be issued again, echoing across centuries until they became indistinguishable. The records show long lists of such documents, each bearing almost identical titles: Edict on Grain Reserves After Flood, Edict on Granary Repairs, Edict on the Relief of Famine, repeated so many times that even the archivists recording them must have felt their eyes blur. Trade in general inspired similar patterns. Decrees regulated the movement of merchants, restricted markets to certain days, set prices for essential goods, and forbade hoarding or speculation. These commands always carried the same tone of solemn authority, reminding people of virtue, harmony, and fairness. Yet merchants knew well that the same words had been spoken under previous rulers and would be spoken again long after they were gone. Even punishment for disobedience followed the same formulas. Smuggling salt, evading taxes, hoarding grain, or violating market rules all carried prescribed penalties, described in nearly identical language across dynasties. To read them is to enter a rhythm where nothing surprises and everything repeats. The edicts became less about conveying new instructions and more about sustaining the idea that the emperor's voice was everywhere, touching every sack of grain, every measure of salt, every coin in circulation. And so the people learned to hear these decrees not as announcements but as confirmations, as reminders that the empire still turned, that the court still ruled, that the flow of goods and resources still carried the blessing of heaven. In the monotony of these economic edicts, one finds the same soporific cadence as in rituals and ceremonies. The words pile upon one another, repeating promises of fairness and stability, repeating threats of punishment, repeating assurances of cosmic order until they blur into a single sound, a sound without urgency, without drama, without end. For the modern listener, letting these echoes wash over the imagination, the effect is the same as it was for the villagers and officials of long ago. The words calm rather than stir, their steady sameness drawing the mind towards stillness, towards silence, and finally towards sleep. Another great theme that filled the scrolls of imperial decrees was the constant reminder to officials to act with integrity. For every emperor feared corruption as much as he relied on the very bureaucracy that so often succumbed to it. Thus, edicts against corruption, against bribery, against negligence appeared with steady frequency across the centuries, and yet they too followed the same predictable formulas, as though one could simply change the emperor's name and date, and the decree would be complete. Let the officials act with uprightness, let them not exploit the people, let them serve heaven and the throne with diligence. Such words, spoken in the Han, echoed in the Tang, reappeared in the Ming, and resounded again in the Qing, so familiar that the officials who heard them could probably recite them without even reading the parchment. A governor reprimanded for taking bribes would receive an edict filled with solemn warnings about virtue, but those words mirrored countless earlier reprimands given to other governors in other eras. Punishments for corruption were spelled out again and again, sometimes exile, sometimes dismissal, sometimes severe penalties, but the descriptions were always framed in the same rhythm of condemnation, invoking heaven's mandate and the emperor's benevolence. To read these documents today is to hear a steady chant, like waves of admonition rolling endlessly against the shore of bureaucracy. The same was true for edicts about diligence. Emperors issued reminders that officials must attend to their duties promptly, must not delay the handling of petitions, must ensure the accuracy of census records, must supervise public works without negligence. Each reminder, however, was simply a repetition of reminders already given, the same words copied, the same phrases preserved. Officials nodded, bowed, and returned to their desks, where piles of paperwork awaited them, paperwork filled with more decrees of the same kind. Occasionally, an edict would praise upright officials, granting rewards to those who acted with honesty, but even the praises followed a formula, commending loyalty, modesty, and adherence to law in nearly identical phrasing across dynasties. To the reader, they blur together, forming a monotonous gallery of virtue proclaimed and virtue demanded, over and over until the very idea of reading another decree induces weariness. These decrees also carried an element of ritual performance. An official summoned to hear such a reprimand would kneel, bow his head, and listen as the words of chastisement were read aloud in the same unchanging cadence. The words may have carried the threat of punishment, but the ceremony itself was steady, predictable, part of the endless rhythm of rule. In this way, the empire sought to maintain control, not through novelty but through repetition. For repetition itself created the illusion of permanence. And so, as the dynasties passed, the scrolls multiplied, filled with admonitions against corruption and negligence, filled with reminders of loyalty and duty, filled with the same phrases repeated until they became less like laws and more like a kind of bureaucratic prayer. To imagine a clerk copying these edicts is to picture a man bent over his desk, brush moving steadily, eyelids heavy, the words so familiar that they no longer register as meaning, but only as rhythm. For the listener today, drifting into slumber, the effect is the same. The words carry no drama, no revelation, only the steady hum of admonition, the endless call for virtue, the endless repetition of warnings and praises, all blurring into a quiet monotone that soothes the mind and eases it gently toward rest. As we come to the end of this long journey through the endless edicts of Chinese dynasties, it becomes clear that what survives in these scrolls is not the drama of history, but its quiet persistence, the steady murmur of authority stretching across centuries, unchanging, predictable, and eternal. To read these documents is not to encounter heroes or battles, but to step into a rhythm that has no beginning and no end, a rhythm of repetition that served as the heartbeat of empire. Each dynasty, whether Han or Tang, Song or Ming, Qing or others, contributed its voice to this monotone chorus, issuing decrees that spoke of harmony, of duty, of loyalty, of virtue, of taxes and rituals, of clothing and ceremonies, of canals and granaries, of examinations and punishments, always in the same solemn phrases, always with the same cadence. The words were copied, stored, proclaimed, and forgotten, only to reappear again in the same form, like waves rolling against the shore, steady and unremarkable, yet constant. Imagine once more the halls of the archives, shelves bending under the weight of countless scrolls, their titles differing only by date, their contents echoing each other so closely that they might have been written by a single unending hand. Imagine the village squares where the magistrates read aloud these words, the people listening politely before returning to their work, unchanged, unshaken, their lives continuing as always. Imagine the scribes bent over their desks, eyes heavy, copying line after line, brushstrokes repeating formulas so familiar they no longer stirred thought, only rhythm. And imagine, too, the emperors themselves, who issued these decrees not because they expected to surprise or inspire, but because they understood that repetition was power, that sameness was stability, that the very monotony of their words was proof of order. In this way, the endless edicts became less about content than about continuity, less about law than about the illusion of permanence. They lulled officials into obedience, they lulled subjects into acceptance, and they lulled history itself into a steady hum that still echoes faintly today. For the modern listener, drifting in the quiet of night, these echoes carry the same effect. They are not meant to excite, they are not meant to awaken, they are not meant to fill the mind with vivid pictures, but rather to smooth the edges of thought, to quiet the restless imagination, to bring about stillness. The endless decrees whisper of an empire that measured time, not in moments of change, but in cycles of sameness, not in sudden turns, but in steady repetitions. And in that sameness lies the gentle weight that presses softly on the eyelids. Close your eyes and hear the cadence. The emperor commands virtue, the emperor commands loyalty, the emperor commands order, the emperor commands peace. The words are the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and in their unchanging form, they become like the ticking of a clock, the dripping of water, the breathing of the earth, steady and soothing. Thus the story of the endless edicts is not a story of events, but a story of rhythm, a lullaby of empire that stretches across centuries, carrying us gently through the monotone of history. And as this tale concludes, it invites you not to awaken with revelation, but to surrender to rest, to let the steady hum of bureaucratic words guide you into silence, into stillness, into the deep and quiet embrace of sleep. That was the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, please give us a like and a subscribe. Your support helps us continue this journey together night after night. And now, we move gently into the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series, the silent expansion of Persian satraps. The Persian Empire, stretching vast across deserts, mountains, and fertile plains, was held together not by sudden conquest alone, but by the slow, steady spread of satrapies, those provincial administrations that quietly extended the reach of the throne. To think of expansion is often to imagine armies marching, banners waving, or battles raging. Yet in Persia, the greater story was not the clash of swords, but the endless flow of documents, regulations, and routines that allowed distant lands to become part of a single empire without drama. Satraps, the governors of these provinces, ruled in the name of the great king, and their authority was defined by countless decrees that outlined taxes, labor obligations, tribute deliveries, and ceremonial observances. From the court at Persepolis or Susa, messengers carried instructions across the empire, bearing words that differed little from one province to the next. Each message reinforced the same themes: loyalty to the king, the collection of tribute, the maintenance of order, the preservation of rituals. Villages in Anatolia, cities in Mesopotamia, communities along the Indus, all received the same rhythm of governance, predictable and repetitive. The expansion of satrapies was therefore silent, almost invisible. There was no need for conquest when a decree could instruct a satrap to extend his reach, to register new villages, to count their households, to assess their taxes, to record their livestock, and to ensure their contribution to the empire's treasury. These orders were written in formulaic language, copied by scribes, stored in archives, and then repeated again for each newly added territory. The pattern never changed. Tribute lists followed the same structure, naming regions, specifying amounts of silver, grain, horses, or textiles, and reminding local leaders of their obligations. To the modern reader, these lists are monotonous, filled with numbers and names, each line echoing the one before. But in their monotony lay the secret of imperial power. The satraps expanded the empire, not with noise, but with paperwork. Not with sudden violence, but with the quiet absorption of lands into a system that demanded routine. Imagine a satrap seated in his provincial capital, surrounded by clerks, hearing reports from villages and towns, dictating orders in calm, steady tones. His words became entries on tablets, clay inscribed with symbols that looked nearly identical from one decree to another. The scribes stacked them neatly, recording tribute, adjusting quotas, noting punishments for late deliveries, reminding officials of their duties. The satrap himself might never raise a sword, yet his influence spread outward like ripples in still water, steady, unhurried, silent. For the villagers under his authority, the expansion was not marked by change, but by repetition. They heard proclamations reminding them to pay taxes, to provide men for labor projects, to honor the festivals in the name of the king. The proclamations differed only in dates, the words themselves familiar, predictable, as though the empire spoke in a single endless sentence stretched across the years. To stand in the square and hear such a decree was to feel no surprise, only the confirmation that the empire continued, that order endured, that the king remained distant but ever present in voice. Over time, these repetitions lulled people into quiet acceptance. Expansion ceased to be an event and became instead a condition, a slow and steady absorption of land into the rhythm of tribute and decree. Scholars who study the satraps often remark that their greatest strength was not innovation, but stability. They maintained roads, granaries, tax registers, and law courts, but they did so by repeating the same forms, the same words, the same orders that had been given countless times before. And so the Persian Empire grew, not by sudden leaps, but by the quiet spread of sameness, by the soft murmur of authority carried through routine. For the listener today, drifting into rest, these details carry no urgency, no excitement, only the steady hum of bureaucratic expansion, the silent power of satrapies, the monotone of history repeating itself in gentle, unbroken lines. One of the most constant features of the satrapal system was the collection of tribute, a duty that bound the provinces together with a rhythm as steady as the seasons. Tribute lists survive from various corners of the empire, and though they come from different times and places, their content is nearly indistinguishable. Each region was required to provide a set amount of goods, often specified with exacting precision, and each satrap was charged with ensuring that the quotas were delivered on schedule. The words used in decrees about tribute followed the same formula again and again. The people were to honor the great king by providing silver, grain, livestock, or textiles, measured and recorded without fail. The archives preserve long sequences of such records, naming Lydia, Babylon, Egypt, Bactria, Sogdiana, and others, each paired with numbers and commodities, each repeating the same simple command: pay and obey. The expansion of the empire therefore looked less like conquest and more like the steady addition of names to a list, each new satrapy folded into the monotone chant of tribute. Imagine the scene in a provincial capital, scribes seated at long wooden tables, styluses pressing into clay tablets, writing the same symbols line after line, noting deliveries of barley, measuring shipments of wool, recording the number of horses sent to the royal stables. The satrap sat above them, reviewing the figures, nodding when they matched expectation, frowning when they did not. Yet even the frowns followed a pattern, for late tribute had been punished many times before, and the penalties were always the same. Villagers experienced this not as sudden change, but as repetition. Each year they brought the same bundles of goods, heard the same proclamations of duty, and returned to their fields knowing that the cycle would begin again. The words of the decrees that announced these obligations were copied in formulaic style, invoking loyalty, praising obedience, and warning against neglect, but their sameness stripped them of drama. They were part of the background of life, like the rising and setting of the sun. The Persians understood that such repetition created stability. By binding provinces into the rhythm of tribute, they made expansion feel less like conquest and more like continuity. To the farmer in Anatolia or the merchant in Mesopotamia, the empire was not experienced as distant battles but as the yearly demand for payment, phrased in words that echoed those of the year before and the year before that. Over centuries, this quiet consistency allowed the empire to stretch across vast distances without collapse. For every new land absorbed simply joined the chant of tribute, no different from those already in the system. For the modern listener, these records appear dull, page after page of numbers and goods. Yet in their dullness lies their power. They show us how an empire ruled without noise, how it expanded through repetition, how it endured through sameness. To let the imagination rest on these lists is to feel their steady rhythm, to hear the hum of scribes at work, to picture the endless line of goods flowing toward the royal treasuries. It is a rhythm without climax, without surprise, without end, a rhythm that soothes the restless mind and guides it gently into silence, into stillness, into sleep. The satrapies of the Persian Empire were not only centers of taxation and tribute, but also responsible for maintaining security. And here too the pattern was one of repetition and quiet order rather than sudden action. Each satrap was charged with supervising garrisons, ensuring that soldiers were supplied, and reporting regularly to the great king about the state of defenses within his province. Decrees preserved from these centuries remind satraps to maintain walls, to guard roads, to monitor the borders, and to keep peace among diverse populations. The language of these commands followed the same formula every time. The satrap must ensure loyalty, the troops must remain vigilant, the roads must be safe, and the authority of the throne must be visible at all times. Reports traveled back to the capital in the same style, written in formal lines, repeating phrases of loyalty and diligence, echoing the same concerns that had been written years before. The garrisons themselves were quiet places, filled with soldiers who performed drills, patrolled the same routes, and guarded the same gates, day after day, year after year. Orders came to them in predictable cycles: secure the caravan routes, watch for bandits, collect intelligence on neighboring tribes, ensure the safety of merchants. These instructions carried no surprises, for they had been issued countless times before. A soldier stationed in a fortress along the empire's edge would hear his commander read such orders aloud, the words steady, the content familiar, the message unchanged. Expansion of the empire was thus marked not by sudden conquest, but by the steady presence of guards, stationed like milestones across the land, repeating the same duties with the same language of loyalty to the king. Even punishments for disobedience followed the same monotone rhythm. Decrees warned of consequences for desertion, for theft, for corruption among officers. And the penalties echoed across dynasties: exile, fines, dismissal, sometimes execution, always framed in solemn words that had been copied from earlier texts. The satraps themselves were frequently reminded through edicts to remain alert, to prevent rebellion, to avoid negligence, but the reminders were so familiar that they became part of the routine. When new lands were absorbed into the empire, soldiers were stationed there, and the same decrees followed them: maintain discipline, protect trade, respect local customs, enforce the king's authority. There was no novelty in the process, only extension, the quiet duplication of patterns already established elsewhere. To imagine the expansion of the Persian military presence is to picture an endless line of garrisons, each repeating the duties of the one before, each receiving the same orders, each reporting the same phrases back to the capital. For the historian, reading through these records is an exercise in endurance, for the words blur into one another, the decrees indistinguishable in tone and content. Yet for the empire, this sameness was strength. The repetition of military orders ensured that every province, no matter how far, moved in the same rhythm, followed the same script, lived under the same unchanging authority. For the listener tonight, these details carry no urgency, no tension, only the steady hum of routine. The soldiers drill, the satraps report, the scribes copy, the orders repeat. The cycle continues. Expansion, in this sense, was less about noise and more about silence, less about victory in battle and more about the quiet assurance of order written again and again in familiar words. To dwell on this repetition is to feel the mind grow calm, the thoughts grow slower, as the endless decrees of military duty lull the imagination toward stillness, toward quiet, toward sleep. Among the quiet tools of Persian rule, the royal roads stand out as the silent veins of the empire, carrying not only trade, but also the words of authority from the great king to the satraps, and from the satraps back to the throne. The construction and maintenance of these roads was not a singular event, but an ongoing process, repeated endlessly across the provinces, and overseen by the same monotonous stream of decrees. Satraps were reminded again and again to repair bridges, to clear pathways, to maintain relay stations for couriers, and to ensure that travelers and merchants could pass without disruption. These orders followed the same phrasing every time, invoking loyalty, discipline, and duty, reminding officials that the stability of the empire depended on the smooth flow of roads. For the satrap in a distant province, each year brought the same instructions: check the milestones, maintain the inns, inspect the stations, report on the condition of the route. For the scribes who copied these instructions, the words blended into one another, indistinguishable from those issued years before, as though the empire itself had one single unbroken sentence about roads that stretched across the centuries. Along the highways themselves, couriers rode with messages sealed in clay, carrying decrees that differed little from the ones delivered the month before. At relay posts, horses were changed, riders drank water, messages were handed off, the process repeating itself with mechanical precision. Travelers observed this quiet efficiency and accepted it as part of life, for the roads were always there, stretching across plains, deserts, and mountains, linking distant satrapies with predictable reliability. The roads also carried tribute, caravans of grain, silver, and textiles, guarded by soldiers who followed the same commands as their predecessors, ensuring that goods reached the royal treasuries without delay. Each caravan looked like the last, each procession followed the same path, each arrival was recorded in the same careful handwriting by clerks in provincial capitals. Even punishments for negligence in road maintenance were codified and repeated. Satraps were reminded that failure to preserve the routes would bring reprimand, fines, or removal from office, and the words of these threats echoed through the archives, copied and recopied until they became part of the rhythm of governance. To imagine the royal roads is to picture an endless ribbon of dust stretching across the empire, lined with milestones that marked distances, watched over by garrisons, passed by traders, couriers, and officials, each step repeating the footsteps of countless others. Expansion of the empire thus advanced silently along these roads, not with fanfare, but with the steady hum of routine, as new provinces were absorbed and quickly connected to the network. Their satraps instructed to follow the same regulations, their people hearing the same decrees. For the historian, reading these records of road maintenance is a dull exercise, filled with lists of stations, distances, and responsibilities. Yet for the empire, it was the very essence of endurance. The sameness of the orders guaranteed continuity, and the continuity guaranteed control. For the listener tonight, the thought of these endless roads, carrying endless messages, maintained by endless decrees, brings a soothing monotony. There is no drama, no climax, only repetition, the same words copied through centuries, the same duties performed without pause, the same empire expanding not with noise, but with silence, its roads stretching out like a lullaby across the land, steady, predictable, eternal. One of the quiet but enduring features of the Persian satrapal system was the careful management of culture and religion within the provinces. For the great kings understood that control could be maintained not only through armies and tribute, but also through the steady assurance that local traditions would be respected under imperial rule. And yet, as with taxes and roads, the decrees that governed these matters were written in formulas so repetitive that they seemed to echo across centuries without variation. Again and again, satraps were instructed to allow the people of conquered lands to continue worshiping their gods, to maintain their temples, to observe their festivals, while at the same time reminding them to offer prayers or symbolic tributes in the name of the king. These commands were copied and recopied, stored in archives, and read aloud in provincial centers with the same tone of solemn authority, until they became part of the predictable rhythm of governance. In Babylon, edicts confirmed the rights of priests to perform rituals in familiar ways, echoing words that had been used decades earlier in Egypt to confirm the privileges of local temples. And centuries later, similar words were issued again in Asia Minor, always framed in the same structure: respect for custom, loyalty to the throne, order under heaven's watch. Nothing about these decrees suggested novelty. They were designed to reassure by their sameness. A satrap who governed in a land with many shrines would hear the same reminder as one in a distant province with different practices. Preserve the order of worship, honor the local gods, but ensure that loyalty flows upward to the king. The reports written in response followed the same model, listing temples, recording offerings, confirming that ceremonies had taken place, and repeating phrases of loyalty. Year after year, these records filled shelves in dusty offices, their lines so familiar that one could hardly distinguish one province from another. Expansion, in this sense, was not marked by the suppression of culture, but by its careful cataloging, its incorporation into the unchanging framework of the empire. The same applied to festivals. Local calendars were preserved. Yet each year, satraps were reminded to record them, to report them, and to ensure that during these events, the king's authority was acknowledged in formal words. These instructions repeated across provinces, creating a monotone rhythm of tolerance and control, tolerance in form, control in practice. Even decrees granting funds for the repair of temples or the rebuilding of sanctuaries followed the same pattern. Praise of loyalty, promise of support, reminder of duty. To read them is to encounter a litany of reassurance, copied across tablets and parchments with no alteration except in names and dates. For the people themselves, these decrees meant continuity. They could still pray in familiar words, still offer sacrifices to their gods, still gather for traditional festivals, but they did so under the silent umbrella of imperial authority, always reminded by the repetition of decrees that their customs survived not through independence, but through the benevolence of the king. The sameness of the words made the empire's expansion feel natural, inevitable, a steady absorption of diversity into uniformity. For the modern reader, paging through these documents is to drift into a haze of monotony, where one edict about temple repairs resembles another about festival observances, where lines blur into one another, until the words no longer register as content, but only as rhythm. And for the listener tonight, imagining these endless decrees being read aloud in quiet halls or crowded squares, the effect is the same as it was centuries ago. A calm acceptance, a gentle reassurance, a slow surrender to sameness. The satrapies grew silently in this way, not with drama or conflict, but with repetition. The steady hum of decrees that tied culture and religion to the throne, a hum that lingers even now, soothing, unchanging, eternal. The administration of finance within the satrapies was another field where repetition became the essence of rule, for the Persian Empire understood that its strength rested not only on armies or roads, but on the steady flow of silver, gold, and coinage into the royal treasuries. And yet, when we examine the decrees that regulated the system, we find the same endless rhythm of sameness that governed every other aspect of satrapal life. Again and again, satraps were reminded to standardize weights and measures, to ensure that scales and markets were properly balanced, to prevent the clipping of coins, to collect revenues in full, and to deliver contributions to the capital without delay. These instructions were phrased in nearly identical language across decades, copied by scribes onto tablets or parchments, stored in provincial archives, and echoed in the reports sent back to Persepolis or Susa. Imagine the satrap seated in his hall, hearing clerks read aloud the familiar words. By order of the great king, let the measures be honest. Let the silver be pure. Let the tribute be gathered without loss. The words might have been spoken the year before, or a generation before, or a century before, for they never changed in tone. Merchants too heard these decrees proclaimed in markets, their content so predictable that they hardly listened, for everyone already knew what was required. Weigh fairly, pay faithfully, record precisely. Expansion of the empire meant only that more markets, more provinces, more traders were drawn into the same unchanging chorus. Tribute might now include new kinds of goods, timber from distant forests, spices from unfamiliar lands, exotic animals from far away, but the decrees that recorded them did not vary. Each list followed the same format: the province named, the goods enumerated, the amount specified, the obligation confirmed. The scribes who copied these lists filled shelves with their monotonous lines, each tablet resembling the one before, until the archives became a sea of numbers and goods, an ocean of repetition. Even punishments for financial dishonesty were written in the same formulas, warning that officials who embezzled or merchants who cheated would face penalties decreed many times before. The sameness was deliberate, for sameness conveyed stability, and stability conveyed power. To picture the financial life of the empire is to imagine long rows of scales in provincial towns, clerks recording weights, coins clinking softly into jars, tallies scratched into tablets, all under the watchful repetition of imperial decrees. Nothing about this changed from one generation to the next. The satraps enforced the same rules, the markets obeyed the same commands, the empire's treasuries filled with the same tribute, and the scribes copied the same words. Expansion was therefore silent, measured not by conquest, but by the spread of identical regulations into new lands, lands that quickly learned the rhythm of weighing, recording, and delivering. For the modern reader, encountering these decrees is a test of patience, for they blur together into long strings of instructions about honesty and precision. But for the empire, they form the heartbeat of endurance. And for the listener tonight, they form something else, a soft hum, a steady rhythm, a lullaby of finance and order that carries no surprise, no urgency, no drama, only the gentle assurance that everything was measured, recorded, and repeated. The silver was weighed, the coins were counted, the tribute was sent, and the empire endured, its expansion silent, its power whispered through the sameness of words copied without end. Another pillar of satrapal administration was the careful counting of people, for the empire needed to know who lived within its borders in order to assign taxes, labor, and military obligations. Yet, as with tribute, roads, and finance, the records of population were marked less by innovation than by endless repetition. The same decrees copied again and again across provinces and centuries. Satraps received orders to conduct censuses at regular intervals, to register households, to count men of military age, to note women and children, to record livestock and slaves, and to compile the results in official lists that were then forwarded to the royal archives. The language of these orders hardly varied, always invoking loyalty, accuracy, and diligence, reminding governors that without proper registers, the empire could not function. To the clerks who carried out these commands, the work was familiar, almost mechanical. They traveled through villages, asked the same questions, marked the same tallies on clay tablets or papyrus sheets, and returned to their offices to copy the results into longer lists. Year after year, generation after generation, the process repeated with numbing regularity. A decree from one reign might say, "Let the households be counted. Let the numbers be recorded. Let the tribute be assigned accordingly." And a decree from another reign, centuries later, would say the same words in the same order, as though time itself had not passed. Villagers experienced this rhythm as part of life. They knew that officials would come, that questions would be asked, that names would be written, that nothing new would come of it beyond the familiar obligations. Each census brought the same outcome: taxes calculated, labor quotas determined, military levies prepared. The people bowed, answered, returned to their fields, and waited for the next cycle. For the empire, the sameness was strength. By repeating the process without variation, it created continuity, a sense that order endured no matter which satrap held office or which king ruled in Persepolis. For historians today, reading the surviving census records is an exercise in monotony. They list villages, households, head counts, livestock tallies, all in the same structure, line after line, page after page, with only the names changing. One entry might read 50 households in one district, another might read 70 in the next, but the form was identical. The archives thus became filled with these lists, indistinguishable from one another, stacked like bricks in the edifice of empire. Even the penalties for inaccurate reporting were repeated endlessly. Decrees warned officials against negligence, threatened fines or dismissal, praised accuracy and loyalty, all in the same steady formulas that had been copied many times before. Expansion, in this sense, was marked not by conquest, but by counting, by the silent absorption of new populations into the endless registers. Each new village added to the empire was quickly reduced to numbers on a list, copied into the same format, read aloud in the same tone, preserved in the same archives. Nothing about the words changed, only the totals. For the modern listener, drifting tonight, the thought of these census records creates the same effect as it did on the clerks who once copied them. The endless columns of numbers, the repetitive phrasing of decrees, the monotone rhythm of counting households, all blur together into a steady hum that quiets the mind. The empire expanded by counting, by repeating, by writing the same words again and again, until its power was less about conquest than about the monotony of registers. And in that monotony lies the lullaby of empire, steady, unchanging, eternal, guiding us gently into silence and into sleep. The satrapal system of the Persian Empire relied not only on taxes, tribute, and census records, but also on the careful regulation of labor. For the empire needed workers to build roads, dig canals, raise fortifications, and maintain the steady rhythm of public works that bound its vast territories together. And just as with other aspects of governance, the decrees concerning labor obligations were marked by endless repetition. The same instructions copied and read in formulaic language, generation after generation. Satraps were commanded to assign quotas of workers from villages, to record their names, to schedule their duties, and to ensure that they fulfilled their obligations without delay. The words were always the same. Let the people serve with diligence. Let the works be completed in harmony. Let no negligence delay the needs of the empire. To clerks who transcribed these orders, the lines blurred into one another, indistinguishable from the orders of previous years. In every province, the same duties were described: digging irrigation ditches, repairing city walls, maintaining storage buildings, clearing roads, constructing bridges. Each task was presented in solemn words, repeated so often that they became ritual. Villagers knew what to expect when they heard such decrees read aloud in the square. The magistrate would unroll the parchment, recite the familiar preface invoking the authority of the great king, then announce the number of workers to be provided, the time they were to report, the tools they were to bring. Nothing in the words surprised them, for the same instructions had been given before and would be given again. The people accepted the monotony, performed their labor, and returned to their lives, knowing the cycle would repeat. Expansion of the empire was therefore accompanied not by sudden drama, but by the quiet extension of these obligations into new lands. When a province was added, its people were simply folded into the existing rhythm, their names written into registers, their duties assigned in the same formulas, their work supervised under the same decrees. Even punishments for failure to provide labor followed the same monotone rhythm. Fines, confiscations, or penalties described in identical phrases across dynasties. Scribes copied these rules year after year, filling archives with lists of workers and schedules of duties, so similar in form that a record from one satrapy could easily be mistaken for that of another. The sameness was deliberate, for it conveyed continuity, the sense that the empire endured without change, that the authority of the throne reached into every ditch dug and every wall repaired. For the historian, these records offer little excitement, just names, numbers, and duties repeated line after line. But for the empire, they were the pulse of order. And for the listener tonight, imagining the endless cycle of workers summoned, duties assigned, tasks repeated, the effect is the same as it was centuries ago. There is no urgency, no surprise, only the steady hum of obligation, the gentle rhythm of decrees that tied labor to empire. Expansion in this sense was not noisy or dramatic. It was silent, slow, and predictable, as new lands simply joined the same chorus of work, recorded in the same words, carried out in the same way. To dwell on this sameness is to feel the mind grow calm, to sense the quiet repetition that soothes thought, and to let the monotony of labor obligations carry us towards stillness, towards silence, and towards sleep. Trade was another domain where the satrapies of the Persian Empire left their mark, though not with novelty or drama, but with the same repeated patterns of regulation that echoed from one province to another, decade after decade, until commerce itself became a steady hum of familiar rules. Markets were vital for the empire's prosperity, yet they were governed less by invention than by the endless flow of decrees reminding officials to monitor prices, to weigh goods fairly, to punish dishonest merchants, and to preserve order in the stalls and streets where people gathered. Satraps received instructions written in formulaic lines. Let the measures be honest. Let the scales be balanced. Let the prices be just. Let no man cheat his neighbor. The words were nearly identical, whether the decree was issued in Sardis, Babylon, or Bactria. Scribes copied them onto tablets, sealed them with marks of authority, stored them in archives, and read them aloud in marketplaces where merchants nodded, already knowing the message before it was spoken. The expansion of the empire meant simply that new markets were added to the same rhythm. Villages and cities that had traded freely before now traded under the umbrella of the king, their transactions framed by regulations that had been repeated countless times. Merchants in Egypt selling grain heard the same formulas as merchants in Mesopotamia, trading wool, or merchants in Anatolia selling wine and oil. The decrees did not vary: honesty, fairness, loyalty, stability. The words blurred together until they became part of the soundscape of the market, as familiar as the call of vendors or the clink of coins. Penalties for fraud followed the same steady rhythm. Decrees warned against hoarding, against altering weights, against raising prices unfairly, and the punishments were always described in the same way: fines, confiscations, public reprimands. To read these lines in sequence is to encounter monotony, one proclamation echoing another, as though centuries of trade had been governed by a single, unchanging order. Even when new goods entered the empire, spices from India, timber from distant forests, gold from beyond the deserts, the decrees that regulated their trade repeated the same formulas. Goods might be new, but the words that bound them were old. Satraps were told to monitor caravans, to inspect warehouses, to prevent disorder, and the instructions were indistinguishable from those given generations earlier. Expansion, therefore, meant not novelty, but extension. Each new land brought its markets, and each new market was folded quietly into the empire's monotone chorus of regulation. The scribes who recorded these matters filled their tablets with lists of prices, weights, and fines, lines so similar that they must have lulled even the most diligent clerk into drowsiness. And for the people themselves, the decrees were background noise, heard and accepted, but rarely surprising. The market continued as always, scales balanced, goods exchanged, coins counted, overseen by the same words spoken with the same cadence year after year. For the modern listener, these records bring no drama, only the steady reassurance of sameness. The empire grew not by creating new rules, but by repeating old ones, not by inventing systems, but by extending them. And in this sameness lies the quiet power of empire, and the quiet charm of monotony, a lullaby of commerce that hums steadily across the centuries. To close your eyes and imagine these markets is to hear not the noise of bargaining, but the steady voice of authority repeating the same instructions again and again, a voice that soothes rather than excites, guiding thought into calmness, into silence, into sleep. As the story of the Persian satrapies reaches its quiet conclusion, we see that their expansion was not a tale of sudden drama, but of endless repetition, of duties assigned and reassigned, of decrees copied and recopied, of patterns so steady that they blurred into one another until the whole empire seemed to hum with sameness. The satraps did not conquer with noise, but absorbed with silence, bringing new lands into the empire by simply extending the same regulations, the same registers, the same tribute lists, the same proclamations of loyalty. Whether it was taxation or census, roads or markets, temples or garrisons, the words that carried authority changed so little across centuries that they became indistinguishable. A decree written in Persepolis about honest weights echoed a decree in Babylon about honest scales. A command in Egypt about temple rituals mirrored a command in Lydia about festivals. A list of workers summoned for canal repair in Mesopotamia resembled a list of workers repairing walls in Bactria. Expansion was thus less about difference and more about duplication. The empire grew not by creating new systems, but by repeating existing ones, stamping the same language onto each new province, until the whole vast territory spoke in one endless monotone. For the scribes who copied these words, the work was steady and numbing, their brushes or styluses tracing the same formulas day after day. For the satraps who enforced them, the duties were familiar, their reports filled with the same phrases year after year. For the villagers who heard the decrees read aloud, the message was always the same, already known before the parchment was unrolled. And for the great king himself, the endless stream of reports arriving from the provinces blended into one continuous assurance that the empire endured, that loyalty was declared, that order prevailed. In this sameness lay the secret of Persian endurance. The satrapal system did not need to surprise, it needed only to repeat, for repetition itself created stability. Each decree reinforced the last, each list mirrored another, each command echoed countless predecessors, until the very monotony became proof of continuity. To read these records today is to drift into a rhythm that feels less like history than like a lullaby, a soft chant of empire that whispers of taxes collected, roads maintained, markets regulated, temples preserved, soldiers stationed, people counted. It is not thrilling, it is not dramatic, it does not excite, but it soothes, it reassures, it lulls. For the modern listener, lying in silence, the effect is the same as it was for the officials and villagers of long ago. The sameness of the words, the unchanging cadence of decrees, the quiet hum of administration, all combine to still the mind and soften the edges of thought. Expansion, in the Persian sense, was not an event but a condition, not a clash but a continuation, not a moment of noise but a stream of silence. And as the story closes, it invites us to surrender to that silence, to let the monotony of history wash over us, to accept that in sameness there is calm, and in calm there is rest. The satrapies expanded quietly, endlessly, repeating their patterns until the empire itself became a vast and steady lullaby, stretching across deserts and mountains, across rivers and plains, across centuries of time, murmuring the same words without end, guiding us gently towards stillness, towards silence, and finally towards sleep. Before we end tonight's story, here is a gentle reminder from me to you. Try not to go to bed with a heavy stomach. It makes rest less peaceful. Put your phone aside a little earlier so your mind can breathe in the quiet. And if the day left you tense, take one slow breath in and one soft breath out, letting everything fade away. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this calm journey, please like and subscribe so we can meet again tomorrow night. Sleep well, and may your dreams be light and kind.